I did not kill Renee and the kids, and I believe I was framed.
A Gulf War Army veteran convicted of a quadruple murder in Okaloosa County is set to be executed any moment now. Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted in 2001 for the murder of his girlfriend and her 3 children in Crestview in 1998. Hutchinson is set to be the 4th person executed in Florida this year. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Hutchinson last month.
Before we get into today's case, a quick shout out to Stephen Hinrichs, who dropped a comment on our Edward Zakshevsky video and asked us to cover this one. Stephen, this one is for you. And to everyone watching, if there is a case you want us to dig into, drop it in the comments. We read every single one, and as you can see, we actually follow through. Now let's get into it. Florida State Prison. May 1st, 2025. 7:58 in the evening. The warden steps forward. He has one question for the man strapped to that gurney. Does he have any final words? Jeffrey Hutchinson says nothing. No confession. No apology. No last statement maintaining his innocence after 26 years of claiming it. Just silence. But the witnesses in that room noticed something. His lips were moving. Barely. Quietly. As if he was saying something he had no intention of sharing with anyone else in that chamber. Whatever it was, he took it with him. Here is what we know about this case going in. 4 people were found dead inside a home in Crestview, Florida in September of 1998. A Gulf War veteran who served as an Army Ranger was convicted of all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He spent 26 years on death row maintaining he did not do it. 129 military veterans wrote directly to the governor of Florida asking him to stop the execution. And a federal court never reviewed the core of his case, not because the arguments were thrown out, but because his own legal team missed a filing deadline. That last detail alone raises a question this case never fully resolved. When a soldier comes home from war with a damaged mind and no adequate support, and then something unthinkable happens, where does personal responsibility end and systemic failure begin? That question followed this case from a quiet street in Crestview, Florida, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And by the end of this documentary, you will have every verified fact, every piece of forensic evidence, every legal decision, and every voice that shaped this case, and you can decide for yourself. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was born on November 6, 1962, in Alaska. He grew up in Kettle Falls, Washington, a small rural town near the Canadian border, the kind of place where most people know each other and life moves at a steady, predictable pace. He was raised in a working-class family alongside several brothers and sisters, including his brother Robert, who years later would become his most vocal defender. By every account, his early life gave no indication of what was coming. After high school, he worked steady jobs. First as a mechanic, then as a security guard. No criminal record. No history of violence. No red flags of any kind. Then in 1986, at the age of 23, Jeffrey Hutchinson enlisted in the United States Army. He did not just serve. He advanced. After time in the National Guard, he transitioned to active duty and earned 2 of the most demanding designations in the U.S. military, paratrooper and Army Ranger. The Ranger program is one of the most physically and mentally grueling selection processes in the American Armed Forces. Fewer than half of candidates completed. Hutchinson did. In 1990, he was deployed to the Middle East as part of Operation Desert Storm, the U.S.-led military campaign to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. He served in forward positions in some of the most hazardous environments of that conflict. What happened to him there did not stay on the battlefield. During his deployment, Hutchinson was exposed to sarin gas and sustained multiple blast injuries. The long-term consequence was Gulf War illness, a condition the U.S. Department of Defense estimates affected between 175,000 and 250,000 veterans of that war. It is not a disputed diagnosis. It is documented, recognized, and in many cases permanent. The condition causes chronic physical deterioration, cognitive decline, memory loss, and in a significant number of veterans, severe and lasting psychological damage. When Hutchinson came home, the people closest to him noticed the difference almost immediately. He developed skin rashes and lesions that did not resolve. He was frequently coughing. He became hypervigilant, constantly on edge in environments that posed no real threat. His memory, once reliable, began to fail him in ways his family found difficult to watch. A neurologist who examined him in the period before his trial documented what he described as numerous signs of Gulf War illness. Those who had known him before the deployment described a man who had come back fundamentally different from the one who had left. 2 marriages followed his discharge from the Army. Both ended. His stability, which had once defined him, was gone. And then, in 1997, something shifted. He met someone. He started over. Or at least, that is what it looked like from the outside. But before we get to that, there is one voice from this case that most people have never heard. A voice that cuts through everything. Shortly after Hutchinson's arrest in 1998, a reporter from Where TV News sat down with his biological son, also named Jeffrey Hutchinson, who was 12 years old at the time. The boy said this about his father. He just had sudden mood swings. Same thing happens to me. One minute you're calm, the next you're mad. And then he said something that very few 12-year-olds would say about a parent. I'm kinda sad because my dad's in jail. But he should be there so he can get some psychiatric help. A 12-year-old boy, talking about his father. Saying he belonged in custody, not because he was dangerous but because he was unwell and no one had helped him. That statement has never made a headline. But it tells you more about the years leading up to this case than almost anything else in the record. Renee Flaherty was 32 years old. She worked part-time for the Postal Service out of Niceville, Florida, a small town in the same Panhandle region where she would later build what she believed was a fresh start. She was a mother first. Everything else came second. Her marriage had effectively ended before it was formally over. Her husband, a military man, was stationed far away at a base in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. By the time Renee met Jeffrey Hutchinson, she was raising her 3 children largely on her own. Those 3 children were everything. Jeffrey was 9 years old, the eldest, the one the family described as sharp and academically minded, the kind of kid who paid attention and remembered things. Amanda was 7. Her uncle Wesley would later describe her as a typical little girl who loved Barbies and the kinds of things 7-year-old girls love. And then there was Logan, 4 years old. His uncle's description of him was simple and precise, a bundle of energy. 3 children. 3 completely distinct personalities. All of them under the age of 10. When Renee and Jeffrey's relationship developed, the decision was made to relocate. They moved from Deer Park, Washington to Crestview, Florida, a town in Okaloosa County in the state's Panhandle. Jeffrey had plans to open a motorcycle shop. Renee brought her children. The household became, by all outward appearances, a functioning blended family. People who knew them said Jeffrey treated those children as though they were his own. His friend Creighton Adams put it plainly. He said you would have thought they were his kids. That is how he acted around them, and that is how they responded to him. Before the move, Renee's brother Wesley Elmore said goodbye to his sister. He turned to Jeffrey and said 4 words that would stay with this case for the next 26 years. Take care of my sister and her kids. Jeffrey looked at him and responded without hesitation. I will. I love your sister. Renee's mother, Melva Elmore, was the quiet center of that family. She watched her daughter leave for Florida with 3 grandchildren and what looked like a real chance at a stable life. She had no reason to believe otherwise. They were never married. Jeffrey and Renee were cohabiting partners, a detail that would matter later when the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office classified what happened in that house as a domestic violence homicide. But in those early months in Crestview, none of that language existed yet. There was just a woman, her 3 children, and a man who everyone around them believed genuinely cared about all 4 of them. That is what made what came next so difficult for everyone who knew them to process. By the time September of 1998 arrived, Jeffrey Hutchinson and Renee Flaherty had been living together at their home on John King Road in Crestview for approximately 18 months. To everyone around them, the household appeared stable. There were no police calls to that address. No documented disputes that had escalated to the point of outside intervention. No restraining orders. No prior incidents on record between the 2 of them. Investigators who later reviewed the history of that address confirmed it. There was no escalating pattern of violence. No paper trail suggesting what was coming. By every external measure, this was an ordinary household. On the morning of September 11, 1998, Jeffrey's brother Dan spoke with him by phone. During that call, Dan could hear Jeffrey and Renee in the background together. He described them as laughing and joking around the way they normally did. Nothing in that conversation gave Dan any reason for concern. He said later that nothing seemed amiss. That phone call happened hours before everything changed. When news of what occurred that night began to spread through Crestview and across Okaloosa County the following morning, the reaction from the community was one of complete disbelief. The Flaherty family murders, as they came to be known, sent a wave of shock through the region that did not fade quickly. People who lived nearby, who had seen that family come and go, who had no reason to expect anything other than an ordinary Thursday morning, found themselves confronting something none of them had anticipated. There is one final detail about that address on John King Road that is worth noting here. In 2016, nearly 18 years after the events of September 1998, a separate and unrelated violent incident occurred at that same location. A 22-year-old man named Jacob Langston was involved in a multiple-victim assault at the same address. That incident drew renewed attention back to the Hutchinson case and left many in the community asking why that particular address kept appearing in the worst kind of news. It remains one of the more unsettling footnotes attached to this case and to that street in Crestview. The evening of September 11, 1998 began like any other at the house on John King Road. Then an argument broke out between Jeffrey Hutchinson and Renee Flaherty. Court records do not specify what the argument was about. What they do document is what happened next. Hutchinson packed his belongings into his Dodge pickup truck and left the house. He drove to an AmVets lounge in Okaloosa County. At the bar he drank beer. At some point during the evening he told another patron that Renee was pissed off at him and that they just needed time to cool down. To the people around him at that bar, he appeared to be a man blowing off steam after a domestic dispute. Nothing more. Back at the house on John King Road, Renee was not calm. She called a friend, identified in court records as Ms. Pruitt. According to those records, Renee was described during that call as sobbing. She was distressed and struggling to compose herself. That phone call was later submitted as evidence at trial and admitted by the court as an excited utterance, meaning the emotional state in which it was made gave it evidentiary weight. Renee also called her mother, Melva Elmore, during this same period. She told her mother that Jeffrey had taken her keys and that she did not know where he was. Those were among the last documented communications Renee Flaherty ever made. Approximately 40 minutes after leaving the AmVets lounge, Hutchinson returned to the house. At 8:41 in the evening, a 911 call was received from the John King Road address. The male caller said, "Yes, ma'am. I just shot my family. I love my family. Ma'am, I love my family." When Okaloosa County deputies arrived at the scene, they found Jeffrey Hutchinson lying face down on the floor of the garage. A cordless phone was inches from his hand, still connected to the 911 operator. He did not attempt to flee. He did not resist. He stood up when officers approached and was taken into custody without incident. Inside the house, deputies found Renee Flaherty and her 3 children. All 4 had lost their lives. What investigators documented inside that home was methodical and precise. A 12-gauge pistol-grip Mossberg shotgun was found on the kitchen counter. 5 shotgun shells, later linked to that weapon, were recovered from the same counter. For people, 5 shells. That arithmetic became one of the prosecution's central arguments when the case went to trial. The medical examiner who testified at trial stated that the physical evidence suggested at least 2 of the children had some awareness of what was happening before they were killed. In his written sentencing order, Circuit Judge G. Robert Barron addressed this directly. He noted that Jeffrey, the 9-year-old, had attempted to protect himself in those final moments. The judge wrote that we will never know the full horror that child experienced. That line came from an official court document. It was not narration. It was a sitting judge's written finding after reviewing every piece of evidence in this case. Jeffrey Hutchinson was taken into custody that night on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. In the hours following Hutchinson's arrest, investigators from the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office began processing the scene on John King Road with methodical precision. What they found, piece by piece, built a picture that pointed in one direction. The first confirmed finding was gunshot residue on Hutchinson's hands. That alone placed him in direct contact with a recently discharged firearm. The second finding went further. Human tissue belonging to Jeffrey Flaherty, the last of the 4 victims, was recovered from Hutchinson's leg. Not from the scene in a general sense. From his body. The third finding was blood on Hutchinson's clothing at the time of his arrest. This was documented separately from the gunshot residue. 2 distinct categories of physical evidence, both recovered from the same man. Then came what investigators did not find. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Every point of access was examined. None showed any indication that anyone had broken in from the outside. There was no physical evidence of any other person having been inside that home that night. No fingerprints. No trace evidence. No biological material connecting anyone other than Hutchinson and the victims to that scene. And then there was Hutchinson himself. When deputies took him into custody, they examined him for injuries. A man who had allegedly been overpowered and physically restrained by 2 intruders inside a home should have shown some sign of that struggle. He had none. No cuts. No bruising. No defensive marks of any kind on his body. Investigators confronted Hutchinson with what they had found. His account was immediate and unwavering. He told them that 2 men wearing ski masks had broken into the house, overpowered him, carried out the killings, and fled before law enforcement arrived. The gunshot residue on his hands, he said, came from struggling with those men, not from firing the weapon himself. Investigators pushed back. They told him directly that the evidence did not support that account. His response, captured in the interrogation transcript, was this: "What the hell are you talking about? Nobody is looking for them?" That second question stopped investigators. Nobody is looking for them. It was a strange and specific thing to say for a man who had just described 2 killers fleeing into the night. It read less like a protest and more like a man struggling to track the conversation, detached from the reality of what had just taken place in that house. Hutchinson never changed his account. Not that night. Not at trial. Not in 26 years on death row. On October 5, 1998, an Okaloosa County grand jury reviewed the evidence and returned a formal indictment. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was charged on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The case was heading to court. And what happened there would raise questions that went far beyond the walls of that house on John King Road. The case against Jeffrey Hutchinson did not reach a courtroom quickly. The road to trial stretched across more than 2 years, marked by repeated delays that added layers of complexity before a single witness was ever called. The trial was initially scheduled well before it actually began. It was pushed back once, then pushed back again to July of 2000. Then came a development that halted proceedings entirely. Bobby Elmore, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case, suffered a heart attack. He needed time to recover before he could return to court. The trial was delayed again. During this same period, Hutchinson filed a formal complaint against his own defense lawyers. By the time the case finally opened, it had already been through more legal turbulence than most cases ever see. On January 8, 2001, the trial of Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson began in Okaloosa County Circuit Court before Judge G. Robert Barron. Before testimony started, there was a critical threshold to clear. The court had to determine whether Hutchinson was mentally competent to stand trial at all. 2 experts were brought in and they arrived at opposing conclusions. Dr. Vincent Dillon, a psychiatrist, examined Hutchinson and found that he met the criteria for bipolar disorder. He documented delusions and paranoia and concluded that Hutchinson was not competent to stand trial. Psychologist James Larson reached a different conclusion entirely. He diagnosed a behavioral disorder rather than a clinical mental illness and determined that Hutchinson was competent to proceed. On January 7, 2001, one day before the trial opened, Judge Barron sided with Larson. The trial moved forward. Defense attorney Stephen Cobb entered the courtroom and described his client in 4 words that framed the entire defense strategy. He called Jeffrey Hutchinson a mentally incapacitated soldier of misfortune. The prosecution, led by Bobby Elmore, took a different approach entirely. Elmore built his case on the physical evidence and let it speak for itself. Then came the first of two decisions by Hutchinson that would define the outcome of this trial in ways that are still debated today. Hutchinson refused to allow his defense team to present an insanity defense. The reason was straightforward and significant. Mounting an insanity defense required acknowledging that he was the person who committed the acts in question. Hutchinson would not do that. He maintained his innocence absolutely. As a direct result of that decision, the jury sitting in that courtroom never heard the full scope of his Gulf War mental health evidence. The psychiatric evaluations, the neurological findings, the documented symptoms, none of it was presented to the 12 people deciding his fate. It was held back entirely for the sentencing phase, where only the judge would hear it. The second decision was equally consequential. After the jury returned its verdict, Hutchinson waived his right to have that jury determine his sentence. On January 21, 2001, Judge Barron conducted a formal legal proceeding to confirm the waiver. He found it was made voluntarily. The jury was excused from the sentencing process entirely. From that point forward, the question of whether Jeffrey Hutchinson would live or die rested with one man, Judge G. Robert Barron alone. During the sentencing phase, Dr. William Baumswager, a psychiatrist from California who had previously examined cases involving Gulf War veterans, testified that Hutchinson's exposure to chemical agents during his deployment had diminished his mental state at the time of the crimes. That testimony was now before the judge. It had never reached the jury. The defense also presented evidence that Hutchinson's blood alcohol level at the time of the events was somewhere between 0.21 and 0.26. Florida's legal limit is 0.08. His level was more than double that threshold. The defense argued that degree of intoxication made first-degree premeditation impossible. The prosecution countered that the sequence of actions that night, the argument, the departure, the time at the bar, the return, demonstrated deliberate and purposeful conduct regardless of his condition. On January 18, 2001, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. On February 6, 2001, Judge Barron handed down the sentence. For the deaths of Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan Flaherty, Hutchinson received 3 separate death sentences. The judge cited the young ages of the 3 children as the decisive aggravating factor in that determination. For the death of Renee Flaherty, he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Hutchinson stood in court and said, "I did not kill Renee and the kids. I believe I was framed." Outside the courtroom, Renee's mother Melva Elmore spoke to reporters. Her response to the verdict was 4 words: "Justice has prevailed." Years later, Bobby Elmore, the prosecutor who had survived a heart attack to see this case through, was asked about the evidence against Hutchinson. His assessment had not changed. The forensics proved conclusively that he had done it. This case is exactly the kind of case this channel exists to cover. One where the verdict is on record, the evidence is documented, but the full story runs deeper than any headline ever captured. If you are watching this and you want more cases like this one, subscribe right now. Every week we go deeper. Every week we find the details that did not make the front page. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The verdict in February 2001 was not the end of this case. It was the beginning of a legal battle that would run for 24 years. In 2002, Hutchinson's team filed their first post-conviction motion. On July 1, 2004, the Florida Supreme Court rejected his direct appeal, ruling that the deliberate taking of 3 young children's lives outweighed every mitigating factor, including his military service. A second Florida Supreme Court appeal was rejected on July 9, 2009. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed another challenge on April 19, 2012. Then came the most consequential procedural fact in this entire case, one that almost no headline ever covered. Under federal law, a death-sentenced prisoner has exactly 1 year to file a federal habeas appeal after their state conviction becomes final. Hutchinson's attorneys miscalculated that deadline and missed it. No federal court ever reviewed his military trauma claims on the merits. Not because those arguments were rejected, because the filing was late. In 2022, attorneys argued that two key prosecution witnesses had been separately investigated by the FBI. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed and rejected the argument. The investigations did not point to any alternative perpetrator. In 2024, the family produced a video for a state clemency hearing. Hutchinson's son Jeffrey said on camera, "He was a soldier who didn't get the help he needed. He at least deserves some leniency for that." DeSantis formally rejected clemency and on March 31, 2025, signed the death warrant. A final competency challenge was filed in April 2025. Dr. Barry Crown evaluated Hutchinson twice and concluded he held a fixed delusion, that his execution was a government operation to silence him. On April 27, Judge James Callow rejected the argument. Jeffrey Hutchinson does not lack the mental capacity to understand the reason for the pending execution. 129 veterans, co-signed by both Floridians for alternatives to the death penalty and conservatives concerned about the death penalty, wrote to DeSantis. Their letter stated, "His mind was a casualty just like any limb lost in combat." DeSantis did not intervene. May 1, 2025. Jeffrey Hutchinson woke at 4:30 in the morning. His final meal was salmon and mahi-mahi, asparagus, a baked potato and iced tea. He finished most of it. At 11 a.m., his sister, an in-law, and a spiritual advisor arrived. His legal team followed to say goodbye. After years of filings and appeals, there was nothing left to submit. At 3:30 p.m., FDOC spokesman Ted Verman confirmed at a press conference that Hutchinson had completed his final visits, was calm and compliant, and that despite a pending stay request, the execution would move forward. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters held signs arguing that doubt should mean life. No intervention came. At 5 p.m., final preparations began. Hutchinson was given fresh clothing and escorted to the room adjacent to the chamber. At 6 p.m. he was led inside. In the witness room, Wesley Elmore, who had flown in from Washington, sat alongside other family members. At 7 p.m., the United States Supreme Court declined his final petition without comment. The warden read the death warrant aloud and asked if Hutchinson had any final words. He said nothing. Witnesses noted his lips moving quietly, as though speaking something meant for no one else in that room. The procedure lasted just over 15 minutes. At 8:15 p.m., Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson, age 62, was pronounced dead, the fourth person executed in Florida in 2025 and the 15th in the United States that year. Here is what the court record confirms. Renee Flaherty, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan lost their lives in Crestview, Florida on September 11, 1998. Gunshot residue, blood, human tissue, and 5 recovered shells pointed to one man. A jury convicted Jeffrey Hutchinson on all 4 counts and every court that reviewed that conviction upheld it. But the record also confirms this. No federal court ever reviewed his military trauma evidence, because a filing deadline was missed. 129 veterans told the governor his mind was a casualty of war. His own son said he needed help, not just punishment. After the execution, Governor DeSantis said, "We think he's murdered other people beyond this." That claim has never been proven. Wesley Elmore flew from Washington and said the execution was exactly what should have happened. Robert Hutchinson says his brother was innocent. Darren Johnson said not a day goes by without thinking of the loved ones they lost. 2 families. 1 case. No answer that satisfies both of them. If Hutchinson had received proper veterans care, if a federal court had reviewed that evidence, would this story exist at all? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Every case on this channel comes from court records, verified facts, and details the headlines skipped. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next case is already in production, and if this one left you with questions, the next one will too.